warm welcome to our next speaker for the day, which is Tanveer Oberoi. Hi, Tanveer, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Vikas. It's great to be here. And hi, Sunil. Hope you all are keeping well.
Tanveer, thank you so much for doing this. Yes.
Yes. So I think Tanveer has been a well-wisher and supporter, and really mentored us over the years in his various roles at Google. So it's been great knowing him as a friend and as a mentor. So I'm going to take a quick minute to introduce you, Tanveer. Tanveer Oberoi actually comes with very, very diverse experience of almost over the last 2 decades across sales and marketing, and also in various fields, right? Sports and entertainment, television, and he also worked with brands like LG, Fever FM, IMG, and Times Network. And of course, now in his current role at Google, he's the director agency partnership and sales, Google Customer Solutions, and he's been there for roughly about 6 years now. And I think it's been an absolute pleasure working with you, Tanveer, and a warm welcome once again.
Thank you so much, Vikas. I think the feeling is mutual. You've got a fantastic team. You do justice to all the briefs that you get from your customers, and it's just been seamless working with the Social Beat team and you.
Thanks, Tanveer. So, I'm going to present your. Should I present your deck?
Yeah, if you could, that would be great.
Great, yeah. Is it visible?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. So the brief that was given to me by the team was primarily the fact that I should be focusing on how the digital consumer behavior in Bharat is actually, and I'll be using the term Bharat quite often, is actually changing. And every time I've actually presented anything to do with the internet and the evolution over the last 6 years, I've been fortunate enough to see this number spiral very regularly. So the first time I started presenting from Google on Google's behalf was the fact that this internet number used to be as low as roughly around 250, 300 million, right? And now we reach a point of time where we are safely over 600 million Bharat internet users. And it's just a testimony of how this country continues to grow and how consumers literally continue to go ahead and invest into this platform so regularly and consistently. Next slide, please, Gus. Right. And I'd like to spend a quick 2 minutes really talking about the country that we live in, right, which is India. I think we are fortunate to be part of a growth journey in a country that's expected to be the third largest economy by the time we hit 2030, right? But guess what? If you were to literally peel this onion a little further, you would actually find that online or the online economy or the platforms have been a major contributor towards this growth, or will be a major contributor towards this growth. By 2030, we expect over 1 billion users online, online users on the internet across all sorts of platforms. And not surprisingly, a lot of that growth is going to come on the back of 2 aspects, or 2 enablers, if I was to call them. One, very clearly, not surprisingly, the smartphone user base, which continues to spiral, right? And in 2023 is expected to be as high as 650 million. So you can only guess how quickly it's going to move even further by the time we hit 2030, right? And secondly is data pricing or data consumption, right? So if I was to take a step back and in 2016 look at data prices, it used to be as low as 3 rupees, if I remember right? And you go fast forward into 2018 and 2019 and 2020, and actually literally now today, data prices have actually gone ahead and dropped by almost 10 times, right? And as a result of this, what's really happened is that we've managed to bring on users which are no longer confined to a specific geography or to a certain socioeconomic class. Now, smartphone users are across the country, data is being consumed across the country, and the kind of browsing behavior that we see online has also changed very rapidly as a result of this. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, let's not go as far as 2030 right now. Let's look at the situation that we are in right now. Over a 600 million users that we're talking about at this point of time. But as this user base literally grows, what we need to keep in mind is that the diversity of needs of these internet users also tends to change very, very rapidly, right? The first column that you actually see, which we call India 1, is you and me probably, right? We were probably one of the first few users of the internet, the first 150 million, as we put them in terms of numbers, had accessibility to desktops, had accessibility to a mobile phone, were English readers, English proficient, and more importantly, were not dependent on a single source of network when we actually had to use the internet, right? We had 3G access, 4G access, we had access of Wi-Fi in offices, at homes, at malls, and so on, right? But the next internet users, right, which we also call India 2, which is the next 200 million, and the following 400 million, which are non users, is the next bit that we really need to focus our energies and concentrate towards. These are users that, and I'd like you to focus on the third and the fourth line, are users that are specifically mobile only users, right? They've got handsets at their disposal. However, they prefer to go ahead and consume the internet or the content in a language of their choice. So it could be an Indian language of their choice specifically. They may have limitations right now in terms of accessibility because they're 2G users, but fast moving towards 3G. They tend to use Wi-Fi, which is publicly available or at their employers. But this is changing very, very quickly. And as a result of that, the needs of these users also continues to go ahead and evolve. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the following few slides as well. Next slide, please. Right. Now, while we've established the fact that digital is a very critical pillar to the economic growth that we see in the Indian subcontinent, I think what's important for us to really zero in is the impact digital is having on the vernacular users or the vernacular content that we're actually seeing consumed online as well. So if you focus a little bit on the graph, you'll find that while you see smartphones really spiraling up, what you also see is that the usage of vernac, which is in terms of search patterns, etc., across different languages, across different areas in the country, zones in the country, has also seen a rapid increase. And it's not really limited to any one geo. The Hindi heartlands, which is the Hindi belt, continues to spiral upwards. All regions such as South and West continue to go ahead and contribute and add on a massive number of new users, which was the middle pillar of the user number 2 that we'd spoken about a couple of slides back, right? So it's clearly going to be a factor that is going to be a massive play in the years to come as well, because clearly it's going ahead and adding on an extremely new diaspora of users to the ecosystem. Today, as things stand, the diversification of internet and economic growth is contributing to almost 73% of internet users, which are coming on the back of vernac users, right? So clearly a massive opportunity for us to really look out for in the future, right? Can we move to the next one? Okay, now let's break this user base up in terms of patterns, right? And two kinds of patterns. What do they do and how do they go ahead and search online? And what do they do when they go ahead and look for videos online, right? Now, and let me take an example, okay? When we communicate with family or with friends, we tend to usually in India tend to communicate in a dual language format. In my case, it'll probably be English and Hindi, and which we commonly now call as English, right? But guess what? A number of times, unintentionally or intentionally, we use the same format even while going ahead and searching or typing on our mobile phones, right? We tend to do a Hindi search using English language. But the catch here being that eventually, when the content populates, we prefer to go ahead and use or basically consume content which is in the language of my choice. which may be Hindi, right? So you may be searching in English with Hindi terminology, but eventually the preference is to go ahead and watch content or read content which is in the language of my choice, right? Now, in order to test this hypothesis further, in 2020, early 2020, around between January and August 2020, Google, through its through its algorithms, basically went ahead and picked up the top 50,000 searches that actually happened between these months. So I'm talking about January to August, roughly, right? And the algorithm then went ahead and broke up all these searches into buckets, right? There was an English bucket, specifically, there was a Hindi bucket, and then there was eventually what we call a transliterated bucket, right? Which was a Hindi search in English or a Hinglish search. And not surprisingly, the maximum number of searches that we actually saw as a result of these 50,000, which was the superset, was Hinglish searches. Okay. Now I want you to take a step back. This is when you are typing. And now, with the emergence of voice as a format, just imagine how these English searches are really catapulting upwards, right? What does this mean for you? What I'd like you to think about is basically the fact that is your brand or you as marketers right now planning your creative strategy basis this learning? Are you planning your creative choices or your strategy basis a language of your choice or a language of the consumer's choice? Yeah, let's move to the next slide. Now, if we go a bit further, so we spoke about search and search patterns. Let's now also look at the same way in terms of video patterns as well, right? Now, just a bit of trivia, YouTube is the second largest search engine in the country today, right? People go onto Google and onto YouTube at almost the same intensity right now. One looking for search content, one looking for video content specifically. And clearly, the reason why the behavior, or you see this graph specifically, where the usage of YouTube is just spiraling again across different categories, whether it be the Hindi belt, the Northeastern belt, or the Eastern Indian belt, the growth rates are fairly high, is because now YouTube clearly gives the opportunity for you to go ahead and connect with communities online. YouTube has content which has been plugged together, which has either been created by you or has been posted by folks, which goes ahead and eventually helps form communities. You're able to go ahead and watch it in demand. You go ahead, it's not an appointment-based viewing. You watch it at your own convenience. You watch it in the language of your own choice. You can watch it across screens. And as a result of this, the consumption patterns of YouTube across different diasporas again and different geos within the country has seen a rapid increase as well. Why am I telling you all this, and how is it related to consumer behavior from a commerce perspective or from an e-com perspective? I'll try and explain that to you in the next slide. Next slide, please. So you saw data with respect to search, you saw data with respect to YouTube, you saw data with respect to the ecosystem, right? How do you ensure that this data is now gone ahead and is best utilized and is meaningful for you to be able to connect with the Bharat audience? Let's spend a little bit of time around this as well, right? There are three aspects to it. Number one, if you want to connect with the Bharat audience, one, you need to get conversational, right? And let me explain this to you. Bharat users are, when I say conversational, are folks who prefer to speak or communicate in the language of their choice and not the advertiser's choice, right? So ideally, talk to them in a conversational format in the language of their choice. And let me give you an example of what I mean by this, right? This is just one such example. There are umpteen number of similar ones, right? We're all familiar with this brand called Maybelline. This brand had basically crafted out an English video, and that from that English video went ahead and dubbed it out into three different languages: Hindi, Tamil, and Bengali. They ran the English video in Delhi NCR market, and they ran the other videos, which were the English, Hindi language, Hindi, Tamil, and Bengali videos in the respective states. And when post the campaign, they went ahead and did a brand lift survey. So when they saw the results of the brand lift survey during the course of the campaign, not surprisingly, all the regional videos, the performance of regional videos was far higher when it came to any brand metrics in the brand lift survey, which clearly indicated that the stickiness of a video when you go ahead and communicate to the audience in the language of their choice, not necessarily English, is far more, right? Hence, get conversational. The second is engage to build a community. And I kind of alluded to it in the YouTube slide specifically, right? All new internet users, think about it, they are coming from tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities. Culturally, two and 3 cities in India are very community based, right? They tend to stick together in occasions such as religious occasions, faith and devotion related occasions, festive occasions, entertainment. They probably go to a movie hall as far larger communities than we do here in the larger cities, and so on, right? They actually sit and do TV viewing as well together. So they have a very strong sense of community. And unfortunately, during the course of this unfortunate pandemic, over the last 1.5 years that we've had, some of these communities have not been able to meet locally together. And as a result of that, a lot of this community content is now available online on YouTube, right? So if you as a marketer believe that a certain community kind or a content kind is relevant to you, then tap into the desire of the audience that actually sits there if they are your consumers, right? And leverage the communities that have either been built or help them build communities further on YouTube as a platform, right? And finally, help them with their functional needs. And I think this is extremely critical. The reason I say this is the new user bucket of users that we have at this point of time. As I mentioned, they may not be very tech savvy. They are using the internet, but they still may not necessarily be using it for monetary transactions to the same level, right? And hence, how can you make their user experience when they first come on and transact with you via an e-com platform um, seamless? How can you make it extremely easy for them? That's what's critical. So very simple hacks, right? And I would highly recommend to understand these hacks further that you connect with your Google account managers probably after this call, and we'll help you out with this. For example, can you make your mobile page experience very simple? Instead of having 10 steps, can you kind of crack the code in just 3, right? Second, given the fact that there are now payment gateways available, can you have the payment gateway integrated into your mobile phone experience, right? And so on. Can your landing page, because some of them may have connectivity issues, right? Can it be light so that it loads quickly, right? So try and help them with the functional needs. Can you integrate voice in some form so as to help them search for you or understand your product a lot more seamlessly as well? So there are so many hacks in which you can simplify your consumer experience when they actually go through the journey of interacting with you. And the Bharat audience, or the next new internet user audience, requires you to kind of approach this a bit differently when it comes to strategy, right? So that's what I had from my end. I'm happy to go ahead and take questions and probably answer some of these offline as well, but I'm sure my team's going to be available anytime in case you need any help with kind of deep diving into any of these topics.
No, actually, thanks for that, Tanveer. I think lots to sort of think about and ponder over as we look at some of these journeys. So, I mean, I'll start off with a few questions while we wait for some of the audience questions. I think you spoke, I mean, the last time you spoke about being conversational, right? And really trying to connect with that audience, tell a story that matters, and a story that connects with that audience, right? And I think often brands find that very challenging, and trying to tell a story, and that to a story in multiple languages to multiple consumers they find that quite challenging. How do you think brands are actually tackling that and still trying to be conversational in that sense?
No, I think that's a very commonly asked question, Vikas, and I think it's still relevant because this is honestly an evolving space, right? I think what we need to keep in mind specifically that it is not media rupees or media dollars that you really put in that goes ahead and drives impact in storytelling. It's your creative that really goes ahead and drives most of the impact, right? So it's not about the amount of money that you really plow in, but it's about having an effective creative and creating the power of communication via this creative that really drives the impact, right? So at Google, for example, we've got something called Unskippable Labs. It's an internal team that keeps experimenting with new creative formats on a more regular basis. And we keep surfacing this on our Think with Google page, where we keep experimenting and surfacing these for folks to go ahead and incorporate going forward. Over the last probably 1 year, at a monthly average, they would have experimented with around 1,000 ads easily, right? And I'm being conservative out here. And what clearly stands out is that there is the basics of creative advertising still hold true, right? Ads that told a story about a product solving a problem were considered to be more interesting and engaging in any way than ads which were transactional. So if you're able to connect via a strong storyline and strike the right chord, then and you're able to explain your product as articulately as possible, rather than straight away getting into a pricing, you possibly will have more impact. Yes, pricing is important, but it eventually has to follow over a period of time, right? Not necessarily upfront. The second thing that I would kind of go ahead and talk about is that not necessarily one ad does it all, right? So in our storytelling, we try and encapsulate the entire story into one creative, right? Usually we see that that tends to crack. Okay, so can you kind of layer your story where you leave the customer or the consumer wanting for more because of the interest you create through your first, complemented by a second, and then close it by a third? So usually a 3 ad format is, from a storyline perspective, tends to work brilliantly, and you're able to establish a better connect with your consumer, right? And especially in the Bharat audience, if you try and overload them with information straight off, there's a very high likelihood that it'll break, right? So you'd rather go ahead and give it in bits and pieces and then try and bring it all together.
Oh, very useful. And I think, even with the brands that we were talking today, I think someone actually trying to build a journey, like you said, with multiple creative assets, but with a single storyline that really makes sense. So that's very useful. The second piece, which I thought was very interesting in your presentation, was around the vernacular piece, right? And I think a lot of brands, and I know even large brands, are sometimes hesitant to actually do vernacular because they feel they're a premium brand and don't want to really dilute that, right? And but while vernacular is important, how do you see brands tackling this premium issue? And is it really necessary for them to really do vernacular at all or not?
Well, I think, because there was probably a point of time where we would debate this, saying that, hey, it's necessary to do it. And we try and justify it, saying that, hey, no, it's growing, right? But I think those times are gone, right? The fact of the matter is the quantum of vernacular users or Indian language users are so high in the country already that it's the necessity is already there. It's the question is whether you've kind of latched on to that necessity or not, right? As a advertiser. So let me try and give you a few stats that may probably try and establish that, right? 90% of India's internet users tend to choose consuming content in a language which is their mother tongue, right? So 90% of Indian users tend to consume content in their mother tongue, right? And when I look at Google Assistant, which is the voice-based platform that we have as well, right? 1/3 of Google Assistant users in the country are currently using an Indian language to converse, right? So, which again is significant. So that's just kind of proliferating the entire growth, right? And finally, when I look at video content broadly, 84% of the online video viewers prefer non-English material, right? Now, putting all these stats together and probably three, four more, which I can go ahead and give, the reality of it is, as I said, the ecosystem is already there, right? The necessity is already there because your consumers across different categories, different geos are already going ahead and using it. The point is, how much are we hence going ahead and leveraging this opportunity to connect with our consumers in the language of their choice, right? So I would highly encourage, and it's actually, we've seen that trend change, because I remember when we spoke probably 5 years back, this used to be a debate that we would have, sitting out of our office. And I remember we did a session for you folks specifically on the emergence of vernacular as a space, and we spoke about Tamil, which was one of the first few languages that we launched. But the reality being, I think no longer do we need to have the same intensity of conversation with advertisers or with marketers, because they get it. They already understand. It's the question is, how fast or how quickly can you expedite it now to kind of leverage this opportunity that's on the table?
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And I think it's not just the creative, right? And often we see brands saying, okay, creative, so we do it. But what about the rest of the experience, right? Your website, your app, your customer care, your sort of everything that it's doing, is it catering to that larger consumer who wants to also shop and do e-commerce in that language, right? So that it's easier for them to purchase. In fact, I was seeing this interesting study that somebody did in rural India where they found that the search bar actually looks like a table tennis bat to the user. It's not a search icon, right? Because we know it as a search icon. So it also goes deeper into the UX and the website. Voice is again something you spoke a fair bit about, and I know, we've also been thinking a lot about how do you really use it from a marketing and from a brand perspective. Is voice just a fad, or how do you see that being integrated into retail, into e-com, into all the D2C brands? How should they start taking some baby steps towards voice? What can they start doing? Any thoughts, examples would be quite useful there.
I think number one, you just reminded me that my phone's with my daughter, who's 5, who's probably using the assistant right now to watch something, right? So I think I need to get that phone back immediately after this call. That kind of brings me to this insight, right? That 60% of users in India are currently interacting with the assistant on their smartphones, right? My daughter being one of them as well. And the reality of it being that if I look at a broader like a broader global number, which has got roughly around 500 million odd people on Google Assistant, Hindi is the second highest used language when it comes to the Google Assistant. And hence, Hindi is the second highest used voice language when it comes to the Google Assistant, which basically means India is literally on the forefront when it comes to using of voice technology. And as the smartphone ecosystem continues to grow, it's large enough already, so we're not really questioning the base right now. But as it continues to grow, this quantum of 60% and will only grow even further, even if I was to consider this being 60% all throughout. Unlikely, it's only going to go further in terms of percentage as well, right? But I think when you're building for voice, right, when you're building any integration for voice, you've got to keep 3 factors, or I would say 3 tips in mind, right? Number one, I would say, is that don't look at voice simply as an add-on, right? It's a complementary format. It's not an add-on format. It's not a novelty, right? It's a reality, right? And I think that's what we really need to keep in mind. Try and identify, where does your user really need voice? How can you simplify it for them, right? So, for example, if I am outside, on a run, and I want to really go ahead and dial in, then I kind of use voice to dial in, right? That's a utility that I have. Similarly, in e-commerce platforms as well, if I need to order in, what's the utility that I can bring in through voice to make ordering inconvenient, right? I think that's the aspect that I'm trying to drive home here. The second piece that we need to keep in mind is, as I mentioned to you, most of the voice utilization is on the mobile phones, right? It's on smartphones right now. So when you design any product, or when you design a campaign, then you need to keep in mind that you're designing it specifically for from a mobile first approach, and integrating and implementing voice from a mobile first approach, because this will continue to only grow further in the years ahead as well, right? And finally, try and leverage voice for specifically Bharat users, I would say, in educating the consumers via your voice features, right? So the idea, as I mentioned, was to simplify it. Now, you could simplify it by reading as well. And secondly, you can also simplify it by educating them that, hey, guess what? You don't need to type it. You can just click on this button and search for me via voice. So it's about educating the users as well as to how to use this as well going forward, right? So it's definitely something. It's about convenience at the end of the day, because voice gives us that convenience. We are in a hurry in everything in life, right? Even while typing, right?
Correct.
Otherwise, we would have had an article being published instead of doing this. It's all about voice and connectivity, right? So I guess that's what it really boils down to right now.
Yeah, and as you rightly said, I think a lot of the 400 users that you spoke of, the 400 non-users in India too, I think many of them are probably not even used to typing at all, right? They are actually more, like you said, conversational, want that solution. We actually had an audience question that came in a bit early, which I thought is relevant here from Prashant Jain, which is, do you think online channel would work for high-end jewelry as well? And I think I would rephrase the question to say, obviously online works for everything, but how should the approach be different for, let's say, a high-end product versus a product which is relatively more accessible and affordable, right? How does that strategy change for some of those categories that are high-end?
Right. That's a very good question. I'll probably draw a parallel also, not necessarily only to high end, but also to higher priced products, right? And I'll try and draw a parallel to this industry as well. If you look at statistics in terms of how quickly the automobile industry, which is a higher valued product at the end of the day, is so quickly digitizing its dealer networks, and is really digitizing and launching cars online as well, right? Or it's just an indicator that now no longer are price points a factor in terms of going ahead and transacting online. So I'm talking from a transaction perspective, whether it be booking or transactions, right? Secondly, I think it's no longer a factor that high-end products are limited to an on-ground experience in totality. You can kind of go ahead and give a phenomenal experience with respect to their product online as well when it comes to content, right? So to answer Prashant's question specifically, I'd break this up into two parts. How you could leverage online is to, one, get your product visible and get your product experienced online by having the right sort of creatives and ensuring that people tend to understand where they tend to come from. A number of jewelry brands across the country are doing so successfully right now, right? The second part of it is from a transaction perspective as well. If you're a brand of repute, if you're a brand of stature, which has gone ahead and established itself in the market, has got solid credentials, normally we see, just as in other spaces, a consumer is not wary of going ahead and transacting, because the kind of audience that you're expecting either way are already internet savvy, right? They are already in that 150 million bucket or the upper half of the Bharat users, right? So they know how to use the internet. They know how to transact online. They have been transacting on e-commerce platforms already. And hence the tougher part of the battle which you had, which was to convince them on how to use the internet, gets taken care of. So I break this up into three. Convince them that your product is the one to buy online by showing them the right sort of creatives and your credentials. Second, help them understand that you've got a very strong buying experience and they need not worry about the safety of the transaction and the quality of the product that really comes on. And thirdly, assure them that in case, due to any reason, that the product is not able to reach you on time, you take accountability for it. If that messaging lands well, I don't see this being a concern.
No, absolutely makes sense to me. We had a question which was sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Which was actually around with so many D2C brands coming through. Um, how is the entire ecosystem evolving, and how do you see that? And this is a question from Pratap, because his point was the cost of acquiring that customer has risen, and especially if your product is of a value which is much lower, how do you kind of survive in the D2C space?
Well, I think number one, in all fairness, get a good agency to help you manage your campaigns, right?
Yes.
So that's a plug-in for you folks. Number one. Number two is, as you're right, I mean, the number of D2C players that have actually come into the market as well, price points are different, price points are lower, and as a result of that, maybe the competition is heating up, and more importantly, the ROI is getting impacted for these brands as well, right? I guess that's the larger problem. I think what I would definitely say is that don't try and ape what the larger brands are doing there. They've been there, they've done that, they've established themselves, right? You need to be very clear as to how do you want to go ahead and define ROI. Is it sales at this point of time? Is it going ahead and creating a certain amount of brand awareness at this point of time? Is it going ahead and working on a full funnel approach rather than the bottom funnel approach at this point of time? You need to be able to define that out very, very clearly, right? And I guess that's so it'll be important to go ahead and really break up your success metrics differently rather than having one common metrics, right? I think it also is a factor, Vikas, in terms of what stage the D2C brand is in. A number of times, what tends to happen is because of either funding or the budgets that they have at this point of time, they tend to kind of go absolute bottom funnel, which is to expect sales immediately. Well, I think then it's a factor of you literally sitting down with your planners and your Google account managers or your agencies to really try and figure out what products are best suited to go ahead and drive that ROI for you. But in case you do have funds or budgets which are a little wider, I would highly recommend that you kind of divide them into two aspects. One is creating your D2C brand and your presence online, right? By looking more upper funnel, creating your audiences so that it eventually goes ahead and translates into long-term ROI and eventually looks at conversions from a long-term ROI perspective. And because of the fact that you have to show sales results, use an X percentage of your budgets to actually go ahead and look at the bottom funnel only. I think that's one approach which typically tends to work and has worked successfully with a number of large D2C, which are now large D2C brands as well. But I'd be happy to have a more detailed conversation with you on this, Prashant.
And I think in the next session, Don's probably going to be going a bit deeper into some of these playbooks as well. So absolutely. We have a question from Rahul, which I'm not sure I completely agree with, but maybe I'll put it out there. His point is the adoption of digital in health has been one of the slowest across industries. I'm not sure if that's completely true, but that's his view. And his question is, are there any insights that Google has around health, and what's the barrier that some of these, maybe some of the larger hospitals and larger healthcare players have been a bit slower? But any thoughts, insights on the healthcare sector to me?
Is he referring specifically to platforms, or is he referring to hospitals specifically?
He hasn't mentioned it, Rahul. If you can expand.
So I kind of disagree with that, honestly.
Yeah.
And this unfortunate situation that we're all in across the country and in the world, this has actually expedited the growth of the healthcare sector on digital as well, right? Initially, while there are obviously aggregator platforms, etc., that come into play, really kind of putting this together, the emergence of the number of aggregator platforms has been fairly large as well, right? They become large businesses currently as well. At the same point of time, a number of localized hospitals as well as national players, the likes of Apollo, etc., have invested heavily when it comes to actually doing their digital setups in place, right? Now they've invested in 2-3 forms, right? When you look at digital from a healthcare setup, one is the digital infrastructure, right? All of them are now well connected when it comes to digital infrastructure. I'm talking about the larger chains, right? The larger national players as well, because that's a digital investment, and then that's literally the building block for what follows, right? Once they've got them in place, they've got their their customer base in place, they've got their client base in place, folks who've actually visited their hospital. They're able to go ahead and connect with these folks on a more regular basis. I can tell you for a fact a large number of hospitals are already doing so, number one. Number two, they're also now investing heavily on content. Look at the number of online related communication that you have on healthcare platforms and hospitals. Compare the last 1.5 years to 2018 to 2017 to 2016. It's chalk and cheese, right? It is the amount of communication about the kind of services that these hospitals provide is also is a massive factor, and it's also one of the major reasons as to why medical tourism in India continues to go ahead and rise as well. The third part of it is also then eventually the experience in terms of feedback, right? You look at the number of testimonials that are now available online when it comes to digital as well, right? Because you tend to go to a doctor, you tend to go to a healthcare practitioner or a hospital basis what you hear of them, right? The amount of time that these platforms as well as hospital infrastructures have actually gone ahead and invested in this has been again spiraling, right? So I think I'd love to debate that further with you, Rahul, because healthcare is one of the fastest growing digital sectors currently, unfortunately due to COVID as well and the pandemic as well. But in spite of that as well, it's clearly a sector which is very rapidly expanding in terms of penetrating different forms of digital usage.
Yeah, and it's across the board, right? I think it's a lot of the healthcare apps, direct-to-consumer brands, like you said, hospitals. I think it's across the entire healthcare value chain. There are a lot of innovations happening here. I think we have time for one last question. I think you'll find this very interesting, Tanvi, is, what happens when, the question is around when will brands like HUL and P&Gs of the world actually spend 50-60% of their media on digital, right? And today, my sense is probably closer to even 20-25%, thanks to what's happened in the last 18 months. But when does that happen? And will that be the time when we really say digital is arrived?
Yeah, so I think I was coincidentally just before this session with a CPG brand. I won't take the name, and we discussed the stat there. So at an average, typically it's around 10-20% is the average share of wallet of digital, if I was to say, against overall media. So when I'm comparing offline TV, print, etc., right? That's usually what the average is. But if you were to go down around 5 years back, this used to be as low as around 2-5%, right? So it's actually moved up from 10 to 20. And I remember those 2-5% conversations, they used to be torrid, right? And so I think it's a journey, number one, right? There are some brands or some sectors that tend to move far quicker, right? For example, travel moved a lot quicker because it was very tech dependent or very online dependent, the number of aggregators that we had. CPG as a space is specifically a very mass sector right now. And as the penetration in Bharat goes ahead and increases further, and the reach goes ahead and increases further, and more importantly, the understanding of reach at the marketeer's end also goes ahead and increases, you'll find this changing. I also know of CPG brands that are already around 30-35% of spends, right? So there are brands that have actually moved a lot quicker, probably because of the fact that right now most of the audiences are in the first 150 million, the first 250 odd million, right? And hence the digital savviness of that consumer is far more, and hence almost 35% of their budgets are there. So when will the likes of Unilever or the likes of P&G, etc. move? I think that's a very broad umbrella. What we should look at seeing is which are the brands within them which have moved already faster because of the kind of consumer types they deal with, and which are the ones which are very mass, which may take a little more time. So I think it's a journey that we're heading in the right direction towards. And as they innovate, right, you look at the amount of innovation that is really coming out of Mondelez just won a Cannes Award recently. Look at the amount of innovation that is literally coming out of the CPG sector. They're on the forefront of it right now, right? The reason why they're innovating is because they want to connect with these consumers as quickly as possible. As digital drives more ROI, as it drives more brand-related metrics going forward, it's a matter of time where this number actually goes ahead and increases further. Don't ask me for a time frame, but I'm hoping it's very soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've been through that journey over the last 15 years. So I think you've seen it grow from 0% to 15, 20%. So thanks, Tanvi, for joining us today and really, giving us a lot of food for thought on what the opportunity lies ahead. So thanks so much for all the support and for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Vikas, Sunil, and Meghna. Really appreciate you inviting me here, and I love the session.
Thank you so much for being a really insightful session, and lot to, I think, amazing times for the entire digital ecosystem. And I think with all the solutions for Google, right from small business owners as well as large brands, I think it's really exciting time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sunil. Take care.
You.
Bye.